Hello and welcome to the interview on France 24. I'm Robert Parsons, and my guest today is someone who's been making waves recently with her outspoken criticism of US strategy towards Russia. Whether it likes it or not, she says, the West is already at war with Russia and needs to wake up to the fact. Molly McKew is the founder and CEO of Fianna Strategies, an agency that advises governments, political parties and others on foreign policy and strategic communications. She was a foreign policy advisor to the former Georgian president Mikhail Saakashvili and to the former Moldovan Prime Minister Vlad Filat. She joins us now by satellite from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for being with us on the interview at France 24, at France 24. Could I just start with that comment you made to, I think it was Politico magazine, when you said that we have to wake up to the fact that we're already at war with Russia. In what sense at war with Russia?
I think this is the part that's hard for us in America and us in the West to understand. The Kremlin has sort of a new set of hybrid warfare tactics that they use against our societies, and they explicitly define it as war, in particular against the United States, which they define as their main enemy in the world. The hybrid warfare is defined by what they call the Gerasimov doctrine, and it sort of explicitly defines that all elements of state power, whether it be military or diplomatic, economic or cultural or informational, can all be deployed in pursuit of their goals and their strategy in the world. And that very clearly defines dismantling NATO and challenging the possibilities of Western power, and particular American power in the world, as their main objectives.
You've said that the way to fight this is, first of all, to be united, but to consider the possibility of having to fight a new Cold War. We won the last one, you said, and we'll win the next one as well. But why do we really need to fight a new Cold War, do you think, in the 21st century?
Well, I mean, the idea of the Cold War is essentially a preferable alternative to a hot one. But I think I'm not advocating that a new Cold War is what we all want or desire. I think that it's a way to begin to think about how we confront the deep, wide strategic threat facing us as a country in the United States and as a member of alliances that are also under attack. We don't have the same type of machinery internally that we used to have in terms of identifying threats and turning sort of our elements of power to counter them. And we're just too slow in defining the challenges that we face and defining the tools and the tactics that have been used against us, and figuring out what to do to protect our societies from the type of interference that Russia is using. It's not tanks coming across the border. It's not going to be missiles falling out of the sky. It's these subversion tactics that are really geared toward changing how we think about ourselves, about our place in the world, and about our own countries. And it's really dangerous, and it's hard to identify. And the declassified version of the intelligence report in the United States about Russian interference in our election process sort of hinted at some of these things and described them in vague terms.
Well, I'll come to that in just a second. But don't you think there's a danger? And Barack Obama, not very long ago, alluded to this possibility himself, that we're over-exaggerating the significance of the threat from Russia, in danger of becoming hysterical about it. He reminded us Russia's actually a second-rung power these days, which produces nothing that anybody else wants. Should we feel that threatened by a second-rung power?
So I think there's two aspects of that are worth looking at. I think the second, which is Russia a second-tier power, you can define in a variety of ways. In economic clout, absolutely, it is a mid-tier economy. It is not that powerful. They do use the assets that they have very strategically, and they absolutely use the cultivation of financial and business ties with Western countries and Western institutions to their advantage. But you're right that they are a smaller economy, and they're not the power that the United States is. But I think that Putin's specialty has always been playing a relatively mediocre hand extremely well, and this is sort of the general phrase used about him. And that's where I think this assessment from President Obama sort of repeatedly over the last 8 years, and from Secretary Kerry and from others, that Russia is a regional power that's a playground bully, that we don't really need to take that seriously, is not correct in terms of how we think about the strategic threat that they play to our country.
But isn't it rather a sort of bipolar way of looking at the world? China, for instance, many would regard as being a much more serious threat than Russia.
I think that's right. And I mean, look, if there's different ways to look at threats. I think China is much more integrated to the global financial system in that sense. They have different interests and different ways of leveraging power and different things that they're trying to pursue. Russia is much more isolated financially and otherwise, and that sort of gives them this, whatever, let's see what we can do attitude sometimes. But it's hard to unravel that because that is explicitly how Putin defines what Russian greatness is. The Russian concept of, or Putin's concept explicitly of Russian exceptionalism isn't like American exceptionalism. It's not about projecting our values into the world. It's this idea that Russia can only be a great power when it is distinct and unique from the world, when it is distinct and unique in history, and when it is not integrated into any of the structures that we understand.
What about that direct threat to the American political process? You were just about to start talking about it a couple of minutes ago, the hacking into the election. And now Donald Trump, just days before he's due to be inaugurated as the 45th president of the United States, mired in a new scandal concerning alleged allegations that Russia has compromising material on him. The intelligence community appears to take that seriously. How significant is this for the security of the United States?
So this gets back to your other question, which I didn't really directly answer, which is, is Russia this great, terrible threat? Should we be panicking about what's going on? I think we need to be very clear-eyed about how they use their power against us and confront it head-on ourselves and with our allies and figure out a better way forward, because we're just not doing it as well as we need to right now, and we're exposing ourselves to their attacks. The one thing that was in the intelligence, the sort of declassified version of this intelligence report about Russian meddling in the U.S. elections, that's sort of the most interesting is the statement at the end where it's kind of, well, they've done this in the U.S. election and they will use these types of things in elections against American allies going forward. But the piece that's missing from that is that they have done it before. These are not tactics or techniques that are new in this particular election. The scale and the scope of them absolutely is. But they've been using these types of information and psychological tactics across Europe and across other places to influence politics and other things for years.
But does
and
it
we
even
need to
make?
see
I mean,
what happened in the United States in that spectrum.
If I can just interrupt you. Assume that Putin is behind this, and the Russian intelligence is behind this. Does it really make sense for the Russian government to be taking such an aggressive strategy towards the United States? It's going to get the hackles of Donald Trump up, somebody who, on the surface at least, appears much more friendly towards Russia than his predecessor.
So the interesting thing about what you just said is this should get the hackles of Donald Trump up, and so far it really has not. He's sort of operating from this defensive crouch in response to accusations about ties with Russia or, Russia trying to help him in the election. The obvious answer should be to go on the offense, to say this is what Russia has done, this is what our intelligence community says. But
that's what we saw his appointees to the CIA, Defense, Secretary of State. That's what they were doing in the Senate in their hearings this week.
Absolutely. And but the interesting thing about most of what they said is none of that has been discussed with the president-elect. This is sort of their thoughts and their ideas and their views, particularly from General Mattis, who has a very strong background on these issues, and from Mike Pompeo, who covered these issues in the House before he was nominated to go to the CIA. So if Trump chooses to have a strong and informed Russia policy, he has the right people there with him to help form that and to help fight it. It's just that so far he has been operating from exactly the opposite position. And that's hard to unravel in terms of how people are trying to look at what all of this means.
But he appointed these people. He must know something about their positions, surely.
Well, let's hope so. The question in any administration is always, who has access to the president when. And you saw this in the Bush White House, certainly, and in the Obama White House, that there were tremendous differences on policy, particularly on Russia. And in different cases, the White House guided that policy and the views of others were not really taken into account. Or in other places, the policy was driven from the State Department or DOD and not really so much a priority. So it does depend on how Trump decides to do his own policy formulation and if this is an issue that's going to be one of his top priorities, which he has said it is.
Trump likes to think Putin is going to be his friend. At least that's what he says. You clearly think that that's delusional, though. You think Putin, Russia, at this point in time, doesn't want the United States as a friend. On the contrary, it would rather the United States was an enemy.
I think there's two aspects of that. I don't think Putin has friends. I think Putin has vassals. And he doesn't really have good relationships with anyone else. It's sort of you're under the thumb or you're not. And that does make it difficult to sort of evaluate these statements of friendship. But I think that the second part of that, which is that Russia requires the United States as an enemy for internal control, will remain true. I don't see that changing in the near future. The architecture that Putin has built of sort of internal silence and control, especially since 2011 when there were the Russia Without Putin protests against him, all of this is sort of dependent upon the idea of Russia as the besieged fortress, as the American enemy sort of outside the wall.
That, I'm afraid, is where we're going to have to end it. Thanks very much to our guest, Molly McKew, and to the viewers who've been watching with us. But stay with us, don't go away, more news to follow.